we are in store for two more great talks to help us understand our culture and our history. First, we're going to hear about the art of Alabama industry from Dr. Katelyn Crawford of the Birmingham Museum of Art, where she's the William Carey Halsey Curator of American Art. There she is responsible for the Holdings American Art and has curated Magic City Realism, Richard Coe's Birmingham, which you can buy the exhibition catalog of out in the store and have her sign it afterwards. And this, of course, is related to her topic, also for freedom, civil rights, and human rights. She was previously at the Nelson Atkins Museum and holds master's and doctoral degrees in art and architectural history from UVA and a bachelor's degree from Columbia. Afterwards, we will hear from Dr. Bridget Cooks, who is going to elucidate us about the art of the civil rights movement. She is at the University of California, Irvine, where she is in the Department of Art History and African American Studies, and her research is focused on African American artists, Black visual culture, and museum criticism. She's worked in museum education like I do here. We had fun talking about that, and has also curated exhibitions including Grafton Taylor Brown, Exploring California, and Ernie Barnes, a retrospective. She is the author of Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans in the American Art Museum, and is working on her next book, Norman Rockwell, The Civil Rights Paintings. And so again, you can meet both of them and get their books afterwards, and we very much look forward to learning from both of you. Thank you.
I want to echo everybody's thanks to the organizers of this symposium. I have to say, I'm really excited to be speaking with you all today, but it's also a little bit bewildering in a great way, because I think this symposium was being organized before I actually moved to the state of Alabama, or maybe even knew that I was going to move to the state of Alabama. And so it's a little bit intimidating and a wonderful way to be here, because I feel like so many people have been working on this material for so long, and I'm really indebted to the research that I've familiarized myself with, and I'm excited to continue doing this work. And so I know some of you, and I look forward to meeting many of you after this. As I said, I'm totally indebted to the work of many people in this room. I don't shout everybody out by name in my talk. Okay. I don't shout everybody out. No, okay. I don't shout everybody out by name in my talk. However, know that I'm thinking about your work, and I'm so grateful for it. So, in 1919, American landscape architect and city planner Warren H. Manning published his City Plan of Birmingham after years of work in the city. Between a list of some articles manufactured in the Birmingham district, a list that included coal, iron ore, pig iron, and coke, and an essay on mineral resources, is a short contribution titled Industrial Beauty by Birmingham-based architect and artist Frank Hartley Anderson. Anderson identified the prospects and peril of making art that represented the mines and mills of Alabama's booming iron and steel industry, asserting that, quote, "The blue flame under the pot, the sparkling beauty as the slag is run out, and later the glowing hotness as the molten iron is run into pigs, lighting up the gigantic furnaces and the steel frame buildings, is a beauty such as no artist can put on canvas. Mere paint cannot convey the brightness of the light nor the fearful beauty of the scene," end quote. But Hartley's assertion, quote, "no artist can put on canvas," his assertion didn't stop many artists from trying to capture Alabama industry. From the time of Birmingham's emergence as a center for the industrial South in the late 19th century to the present day, the iron and steel industry has shaped Alabama art, particularly work made in the central part of the state. The art of industrial Alabama emerged in the 1880s and may have reached its zenith in the 1930s, but the state's industrial history continues to shape contemporary art being made here now. I'll touch on each of these things, that early work, the 1930s, and then contemporary representations of industry in my talk.
Representations of the iron and steel industry in Birmingham were first made as the industry grew explosively in the late 19th century. Called the Magic City because it emerged almost overnight in this period, Birmingham became a center for the industrial South. It was featured in a series of illustrated articles in the popular periodical Harper's Weekly, alongside Richmond and Atlanta. Birmingham's natural resources left it uniquely situated for iron and steel production due to its deposits of iron ore, coal, and limestone, the three ingredients needed to make iron and steel, alongside its confluence of railroad lines. This image, the great industry of Birmingham, a pig iron furnace, was among the wood engravings that illustrated that Harper's Weekly article. Your industry has already found its monumental place within Alabama, with Alice Furnace towering over workers producing pig iron. The furnace dominates the composition, steaming as it looms over its casting shed. Workers stand beneath the shed's Romanesque arches, risking their lives to move molten iron into channels trenched in the sand. Yet that threat isn't pictured here. This image glorifies the industry supported by Alabama state officials at the end of the 19th century. The impacts of industry are only visible by comparison of wood engravings published by Harper's in 1887, a few months apart. In the article that accompanied the illustration of Montgomery, which you see at the right, the city was compared favorably with Birmingham. Quote, "The pure air, the absence of din and clatter, and the evidence of a long-established prosperity that form distinctive features of Montgomery, the capital city of Alabama, are refreshing in contrast to the smoke, noise, and feverish bustle of the more recently founded coal and iron towns of the state," end quote. But despite its smoke, noise, and feverish bustle, Birmingham continued to boom. It grew from 3,000 people in 1880 to 26,000 people in 1890, 38,000 people in 1900, and by 1910, the city was an urban center for the region, populated with 132,000 people and still growing. The promise of industrial growth is visualized in Horace Bradley's image of Birmingham area coke ovens at the left. It isn't just the industrial infrastructure or the quickly built uniform housing for workers seen in the back left of the composition. It's also the dark, heavily clouded sky. The smoke and smog blanketing the city has entirely obscured that sky, blocking clouds of the type that populate the sky in the Montgomery scene. These smoggy byproducts of industry here distinguish Birmingham's New South from Montgomery's antebellum past. For many Alabamians, the development of this modern industry signaled optimism and a path toward the state's future. This industry and its industrial byproducts became key aspects of Americans' understandings of Alabama, imaged on both popular postcards, and you see two of those here showing Alice Furnace on the left and then the Ensley Works on the right, and in broader visual culture. These scenes also took hold in fine art, being created by living artists working in the city and state. One early example of this influence is this poster for the Birmingham Art Club's 7th annual exhibition. Here, using flat planes of orange, purple, and blue, Alabama-born artist Lucille Douglas overlaid the Birmingham Art Club's exhibition information against a furnace, smokestack, and massive slag heap that dominates the foreground. Douglas's illustration was also the cover of the exhibition's catalog, and it equated Birmingham's industrial landscape with national and international subjects. In the same exhibition, Douglas also showed paintings of California and Cadiz, Spain. These paintings are now unlocated, but based on newspaper accounts, they sound stylistically similar to her Birmingham Art Club poster, quote, "broadly painted in tempera." Internationally trained and educated as an artist, Douglas equated the industry of her city of residence with subjects more commonly pictured by an educated American artist working in a representational style in the 1910s. While Lucille Douglas's image of Birmingham's iron and steel industry appears to have been a one-off, created specifically for the Birmingham Art Club's exhibition in the city, By about 1920, a second internationally trained and renowned artist was drawn to capture the city's industrial spaces. In 1920, Roderick D. Mackenzie visited his brother in Fairfield, where he became infatuated with Tennessee Coal and Iron's furnace. He set his sights on representing the iron and steel industry through a series of works set within that furnace, and he received permission to visit their steel plant in Ensley and work on the project starting in 1921. Mackenzie strapped on a miner's lamp and began working in the same spaces where steel was made, and you see him working on these pastels at the left. He moved between casting pits, furnaces, and slag heaps, picturing their looming infrastructure, blinding fire, and billowing steam. Over the course of what was likely 14 months or thereabouts, Mackenzie worked in the plant, producing 43 pastels on canvas of steel production and one sculpture. All of these were later exhibited as the series Spirit of the Furnaces. Mackenzie worked at night, focusing on the spectacle of the steelmaking process. In pastels like mixers and converters, as well as burst of gas and sparks, which you have at the right, Mackenzie employed vibrant colors to depict the glow of molten metal being moved, the heat of sparks and fire, and the purple haze of smoke and gases. Mackenzie blended his own pastels to achieve these tones, and one news article in the Birmingham Post reported that, quote, "Superintendents and chemists of the mill can tell from the colors just what chemical action is taking place and how long each process has been going on," end quote. When they were created, Mackenzie's pastels were exhibited across the country, as often to illustrate these new industrial scenes and processes as they were for their artistic merit. In Mackenzie's vibrant pastels, he's more focused on the industrial process itself than the people powering Birmingham's mills and mines. Not all of this series is located today, but many of his images are known either through their located pastel or through lithographs he made after these works, and his figures serve as a kind of industrial staffage. They convey the scale of their surroundings and offer interest, but these figures are neither indicators of the danger workers faced in these settings, nor representative of the complex relationships that workers had with one another. Mackenzie's concern was technology, not its impact on Central Alabamians. His works, however, offered a picture of Alabama's steel industry to the world and the art establishment. His pastels were popular when they were first shown in the mid-1920s, and they continued to offer the country a glimpse of Birmingham's industrial spaces into the 1930s. In 1931, 5 of these works were also reproduced in Fortune magazine. The accompanying text conveyed the technical details of the steelmaking process and exactly what was happening in the works when Mackenzie created his imagery. That viewers saw Mackenzie's works as documents of modernity is only further affirmed by the articles surrounding them in the Fortune issue, including a featured article on Roebling cables, wire rope suspension bridges made with steel, and the Hudson River Bridge. Continually captivated by this subject, Mackenzie added 4 pictures to the series in 1931 and another 6 in 1937. Ultimately, there were 55 works in total in the series. These images were further distributed, as I said, as lithographs, which Mackenzie also created. Mackenzie and Frank Hartley Anderson interacted in Birmingham in the 1920s. But Anderson moved to bring the American scene to Alabama in the 1930s. In his work, he turned to industry as a subject with the interest that some American artists were bringing to representing agrarian communities. His woodcut, Contrast, offers up the multiple perspectives available to artists interested in picturing Alabama communities in the 1930s, with a horse and plow represented against a background of a furnace and smog. Here, Anderson foregrounds the people that Mackenzie only gestured to in his scenes, representing the transitioning way of life the iron and steel industry meant for Alabamians, especially Central Alabamians. Birmingham's furnaces had brought thousands of people to the city, but for them to live in company housing and labor in furnaces, they were often leaving behind rural lives and occupations. Many Alabama artists joined Anderson in representing Central Alabama's furnaces in the 1930s. This included artists less known for these representations, including Carrie Hill at the left and Ann Goldthwait, who we have at the right. At the left, Hill pictured Trussville Furnace in an impressionistic watercolor just before it was dismantled in 1933 and after it had been closed for 14 years. On the right, Goldthwait pictures Birmingham from the countryside, offering an image similar to Anderson's, where rural life gives way to modernity. And I just wanted to show you this at a larger scale because I really love Goldthwait's painting of the city, in particular because it's so clearly a representation of Birmingham really imagined through her artistic lens. You're definitely looking down at Jones Valley from the rural Alabama countryside in a way that I don't think you could have in this moment, but it's dominated by smokestacks. They really sort of fill the sky, and this is an oil on canvas, I believe. I haven't seen this, though it's here in Montgomery. But she's like heavily delineating that smoke and smog, which characterizes the sky in lieu of clouds. Fellow Alabama artists or travelers of Alabama helped Anderson in creating a body of images of the city, including Richard Coe, Howard Cook, and Lamar Dodd. Each of these artists explored industrial Birmingham in their own way through their work. Howard Cook only worked in Alabama for 6 weeks, but he did manage to make his way into the spaces manufacturing iron and steel, representing both machinery and the people working in these spaces. Cook was on a tour of the southern United States funded by a Guggenheim Fellowship when he arrived in Birmingham. His drawings of Birmingham industry in the 1930s are beautiful, evoking precisionist aesthetics, and they expand representation of industry, capturing laborers both black and white. They are also few by virtue of his short stay in the city and largely focused on quickly capturing the interiors of the city's furnaces. Lamar Dodd lived in Birmingham from 1934 to 1937. Dodd pictured Birmingham's landscape and the city's streets in paintings like Steel Mill Glow and Alabama Steel Mills, which is in the Alabama Landscapes exhibition. In 1934, he found himself in a conversation with a journalist, James Saxon Childers, who later recounted their profound exchange in the art store where Dodd worked, quote, "At the end of the shelf stood a painting, a slag dump, hot, massive, dust on its slope, dust on the weeds at its base. An hour later, I left the shop, drunk as whiskey on his talk about the beauty of a slag dump. The beauty in molten steel, in coke ovens, in stacked pig iron. He talked about the rhythm of cotton pickers, the shape of a pine tree. Then he came back to the beauty in the streets of Birmingham," end quote. More than an interest in the people of the city, Dodd painted cityscapes and landscapes, all of which reveal the influence of industrial growth, whether in an illuminated nocturne of the type seen here, or in the rise of slag heaps on the landscape. And I think what you're actually seeing in the landscape that's in the Alabama Landscapes exhibition is the furnace separated from the landscape in the foreground by a series of slag heaps. So, as I said at the start of my talk, though, I came to my interest in the art of Alabama industry through the work of a lesser-known artist living in Birmingham in the 1930s, Richard Coe. Coe is also represented in the Alabama Landscapes exhibition. Coe's work was recently featured at the Birmingham Museum of Art as one of our bicentennial projects, an exhibition called Magic City Realism, Richard Coe's Birmingham. Our museum now owns a vast trove of Coe's work made in Birmingham in the 1930s that was previously unknown. Because of the extent of his representations of Birmingham in this moment, I think Coe's etchings offer an important lens onto Alabama industry, so I'm going to dwell on them for just a moment. Coe was an Alabamian by birth, but he left the state for training. He returned to Birmingham from 1934 to 1939, likely drawn back by the prospect of employment during the Great Depression. During that time, he worked for the Works Progress Administration's Federal Arts Project, painting a mural at Woodlawn High School that survives, supervising the Children's Museum at Henley School, and briefly serving as the supervisor of state art projects for the Alabama WPA. While living in Birmingham, he produced this significant body of etchings, of which Birmingham Downtown is one. The extent of his etchings of Birmingham is unknown, as is the purpose for creating these works, though I tend to think they were created to illustrate a federally funded book or volume about industrial Alabama that was never realized, as representing local industry was a real priority for federal programs. In these etchings, Coe pictures Birmingham through the lens of industry, documenting landmarks in the city tied to this industry, industrial sites themselves, and the residences housing people who worked in the city's mines and mills. Because of the unique nature of the group of works that came to the BMA, these were likely a portion of the contents of Coe's studio in Birmingham when he moved back to New York in 1939. We are offered a glimpse not only into industrial Alabama in the 1930s, but also how Coe developed strategies for picturing it. And Coe is probably part of why I'm so fascinated by the skies in Alabama landscapes now. Here we see 3 states of Birmingham downtown. Although Sloss Furnace can only be recognized through a faint rolling cloud on the distant horizon, and you see that over here, this is a scene dominated by industry. Through these 3 states of his print, Coe etches additional lines, moving from what you have at the left, which is just a faint haze, to what you have at the center, something that could be, a cloudy sky almost, to an unmistakably smoggy scene at the right. And as I was curating this show, this makes me think of this. As I was curating this show, I was talking to people, to our patrons and other people, as I was getting to know Birmingham, and they repeatedly said to me that they wouldn't keep their windows open in Birmingham in the 40s and 50s because of the thickness of the smog in the city. So, this was dense, and it really did characterize the city. Here, Coe foregrounds that environmental degradation, clearly picturing industry without imaging a furnace. And I just wanted to give you a sense of this from a period photograph as well from the early 1900s. This is Birmingham blanketed in what Lamar Dodd characterized as, quote, smog like a veil. Coe also painted extensively in oils, working through American scene ideas about painting everyday Americans in a regionalist visual vocabulary inspired by Thomas Hart Benton. Benton's America Today would have been known to Coe, a massive 10-panel panorama painted for the boardroom on the 3rd floor of the New School for Social Research in Greenwich Village, New York. Benton painted panels focused on different regions, the South, the Midwest, the West, and the Northeast, as well as panels filled with the enormous machines that embodied modernity and industrial might. And you see that here in instruments of power on the left and steel on the right. Coe takes up Benton's visual vocabulary not only in his prints, but perhaps most evidently in his spectacular paintings of Birmingham, including Birmingham's steel mill, which is on view at the end of the long gallery here. And it's truly a wonderful work in person. It's a little bit hard to read on the screen, but Coe's a really dynamic and exceptional painter who I wish was better known. This figure is really just created with 2 or 3 brush strokes, and I think he moves paint around in really beautiful ways, so that's worth going to look at closely. Coe and Benton engage with many of the same conventions in their respective representations of ironworks. And in the case of Coe's painting, this is a misnamed painting. He pictures Sloss's iron furnace, not a steel mill. And Benton's representation of what is a steel mill, Bethlehem Steel's Sparrows Point plant in Maryland. There are formal echoes between these paintings in their mammoth figures, billowing smoke, and dynamic, foregrounded representations of labor. This was the regionalist spirit, whether rural or industrial, and in Coe's hands, it became Birmingham's art for Birmingham's people. And I wanted to indicate to you that it's not just in painting that this is happening. A lot of these representations are also happening in printmaking, which is heavily funded by federal programs as well, and so I think Coe is pulling on both of those sources to sort of make ends meet in this moment. This is a federally funded artist, Elizabeth Olds, who's producing this print blast furnace. And then you also see federal projects that show the impact of this industry in the building of cities with things like Samuel Margulies' prints. There were murals capturing Birmingham's industrial successes for its citizens, and here you see Frank Hartley Anderson and his wife Martha Fort Anderson's Spirit of Steel mural, looking at steel manufacturing in a post office in Fairfield, Alabama, also a WPA project. And it's within this body of federally funded prints depicting industry that I think Coe's etchings of Birmingham belong, and where I think he finds the opportunity to say new and interesting things about industrial Alabama in the 1930s. Coe's Birmingham etchings prominently feature the complex technology and human labor that allowed Birmingham to emerge like magic. Prints, oh gosh. Sarah, can you make it not skip without me clicking the clicker? My apologies. We're looking at idle furnace right now. Coe's Birmingham etchings prominently feature the complex technology and human labor. I'm worried that it's going to leave. That allowed Birmingham to emerge like magic. Prints such as idle furnace offer the viewer a less frequently seen perspective on what is likely United States Steel Company's Ensley facility. It changed hands between Mackenzie's 1920 representations of it as TCI and Coe's in the 1930s. Coe carefully dwells on the most intricate components of the furnace, observing the works with the careful geometry characteristic of precisionist representations of this sort of material. Furnaces spit soot in the background of almost all of Coe's representations of the city's skyline, and the neighborhoods he represented grew around those factories as housing for workers. A bit of the optimism of that smog slips briefly in idle furnace, however. Because we have the proper title for this etching, a rarity for this group of prints that we were able to accession, we know that the furnace Coe is representing isn't operational, explaining the clear background in the image as well. Here, the effects of the Depression creep into this body of work, as U.S. Steel's Ensley Works had to shut down intermittently during the 1930s. Sloss City Furnaces is Coe's most commonly represented furnace, unsurprising as he's living just blocks away. Sloss spews smoke into Birmingham's atmosphere as well, as seen here in the etching on the left of Sloss from an overlooking neighborhood, and in the etching on the right of Sloss behind the Weatherly Viaduct, which is now the First Avenue Viaduct. In his prints and Montgomery's painting, Birmingham Steel Mill, the viewer is offered a sense for what Coe sees in Sloss, a place where he would have had to work to secure access to spaces like the casting shed for Blast Furnace No. 1, which is shown in Montgomery's painting. Birmingham Steel Mill conveys the excitement and dynamism of the atmosphere in the casting shed. Smoke rolls from the molten iron pouring from the blast furnace, and sparks illuminate the background. Labor is prominently featured, as I said, with stretching, straining, glorified workers pictured in the painting's foreground, characterized with mere slashes of paint. Coe's vivified representations of iron and steel, and more specifically Sloss, are not unlike the works that we've seen by Anderson and Cook. But in representing Sloss in such detail as he does in other examples from this series, he's also capturing its recent technological evolution here. In 1927, the blast furnaces at Sloss were entirely reconstructed and modernized, with new furnace jackets and skip hoists allowing for more efficient work that required fewer laborers. Coe's admiration for the technology at Sloss emerges in his etchings. In Sloss Blast Furnace, Coe focuses specifically on the towering furnace with its new skip hoist and cars. You see that here. The scene is entirely out of proportion. The blast stoves at the left of the furnace are in reality almost the same height as the furnace itself. Coe also monumentalized the Sloss coke bins, which you see at the right of the screen, which stored coke, which is a derivative of coal, one of the raw ingredients necessary to produce iron. And he doesn't stop this documentation at the actual sort of machinery of the furnace either. Here are two period images of slag dumps around Birmingham. And he takes these as a subject for his work as well. Birmingham's ore was especially impure, producing an excessive slag. Piles grew all around the city. It was really very dominant, including very close to Sloss and downtown. They shaped the city's landscape and these piles are also subjects for Co. And of course, we also saw this in Lucille Douglas's much earlier image. In this moment, Birmingham was covered in these slag piles, and Sloss was just beginning to find uses for the material, crushing it for street ballast and concrete. It's also worth noting that I think Lamar Dodd is representing slag piles in a number of his landscapes, as I said, including Alabama steel mills. We'll go there. He also represents industry shaping Birmingham's residents and their neighborhoods beyond the furnaces. He does this in images of Birmingham's low-income neighborhoods in particular from the 1930s, one of the most distinct aspects of this body of work. Co was drawn to the people who moved to Birmingham for work. He represented the city's poor residential neighborhoods, both black and white. And this is one good example of this. I'll show you a few more. But part of what's also unique about this is not only its subject, and these are really one of the only places you can see these neighborhoods represented, as far as myself and individuals at the Birmingham Public Library can tell, but also the fact that we know the very specific alley in which this was represented, because again, this is one of the few titled etchings in this group. So I have a good sense that these are all of very specific places. Here are two more. This group includes many, as I said, unidentifiable residential locations, and they largely picture black neighborhoods that were located in downtown Birmingham and near the furnaces, but which have now essentially all been demolished, making Coe's residential etchings a totally unique document. No other photographic or artistic record captures these places, and these images do connect very directly to the city's industry in somewhat unexpected ways. The laundry pictured in both of these images, hanging on those lines, was likely laundry that these women were taking in to make extra money for their families, which was a really common practice in neighborhoods like Sloss Quarter, and particularly among African American women. Alabama industry also shaped federal photography, of course. Coe settled in Birmingham at a moment when it had already been savaged by the Great Depression. Birmingham was among the nation's hardest hit cities. 25% unemployment was the rate in 1934, 25%. And Alabama was among the hardest hit states. Nowhere is this more visible than in photography funded by the federal government in this period. Taken from about 1935 to 1943 by many photographers, these images were created to support Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. When Roosevelt took office in March of 1933, 25% of the national labor force was without jobs. In Birmingham, that rate was much, much higher, with just 15% of Birmingham's previous workforce fully employed in 1933. So that's 85% unemployment. In 1930, 68% of the city worked in blast furnaces, steel mills, foundries, and fabricating plants. The city's steel production sank to its lowest level in 1932. The steel mills never shuttered, but they did close intermittently, averaging production at 40 to 60% of capacity. Blast furnaces and ore mines operated completely sporadically, and coal mines fared only a bit better. Of the 56,000 families on relief statewide in 1934, the year Richard Coe moves to Birmingham, 28,000 of those families lived in the city. And I'm sharing all of that because I feel like when photographers like Arthur Rothstein and Walker Evans turn their lens to Birmingham, you see something very different. They're invested in the effects of that, and thus in Alabama industry. It shapes the vision of the city presented by WPA photographers like Rothstein and Walker Evans, who turn their lenses on the urban poor. Evans' dormant steel mill signals the future of these massive structures. Evans' dormant steel mills, pictured here, signals the future of these massive structures. And it's their post-industrial lives of decay that continue shaping contemporary art into the present day, as the iron and steel industry has never recovered to pre-depression levels after the 1930s. A couple of quick examples of that. Here, Bill Christenberry, who of course is known for picturing rural Alabama primarily, engages with the history of Birmingham, photographing Sloss. By juxtaposing the furnaces with railroad tracks that run alongside them, he evokes Birmingham's economic history from its genesis at the intersection between two rail lines to its boom as a center for iron and steel and the decline of those industries. from an Alabamian to non-Alabamians, industrial decline is also at the center of German artists Bern and Hilla Becker's photographs of Alabama furnaces. Excuse me. A husband and wife team of photographers, the Beckers are known for their cold, objective images of European and American industry. These images are part of a series of photographs of 223 blast furnaces across the world. The Beckers brought this work here to central Alabama, where they photographed blast furnaces, including the two you see here. And at the left is Sloss furnace. You might recognize it at this point, which again we've seen represented over and over and over, I think largely because it's so central to Birmingham's geography. But I want to wrap up not with images of industry, but with the material and history of industry in Alabama, as it's found within the work of some of the state's most important contemporary artists, including Lonnie Holley, Thornton Dial, and Joe Minter. Lonnie Holley's career as an artist began through his carving of a sandstone-like material that was the byproduct of an industrial pipe casting process. He carved tombstones for two of his nieces, who died tragically in a house fire, from a waste mold composed of sand bound by resin, scavenged from a nearby industrial foundry. He continued drawing on this resource for several of his sculptures, of which his self-portrait in the BMA collection, The Mystery of the White in Me, at the left, is one. Holley was also commissioned to create a site-specific work at Sloss Furnaces in 1990, and this piece was realized in 1993. Holley's grandfather had worked at the iron foundry in downtown Birmingham. In a large field, Holley built a sculpture approximately 12 feet high and 20 feet across from materials found in and around Birmingham's iron and steel mills. You're obviously not seeing that here. There aren't great photographs of this that I've found up to this point. If anybody has them, I welcome them. This sculpture, called The Goal of Creativity, was about the questions and challenges facing Birmingham. According to Holley, the goal in the title was personal and communal, to fix social ills or address social ills: poverty, homelessness, drugs, crime, breakdown of family, and the destruction of the environment, ill-shaped in part by Birmingham's industrial legacy. In this sculpture and across his work, made with industrial materials and influenced by an industrial context, Holley ties together Black history from Africa through slavery to the present day. But this came from furnaces, connecting Holley's work not only to African metalworking practices, but also to the convict leasing system, which provided substantial numbers of workers for the coal mines and furnaces. Young Black men from rural agricultural areas provided the majority of this coerced labor force. The workers at risk in Birmingham's mines and mills were overwhelmingly people of color, and Holley's work brings central Alabama's industrial history into conversation with African history, on which central Alabama was also built. Holley's sculpture at Sloss and about Sloss was destroyed a year after he created it by the city of Birmingham in 1994. He then assembled the piece at the right of the screen, Pressure from the Burn, as an homage to the goal of creativity. Using two pieces of wood from a railroad track at Sloss, Holley creates a cross wrapped in a fire hose. Here he lifts up his practice and African-American culture in the face of those who would do it harm, including those, in his mind, who tore down the goal of creativity. The sculpture further references the civil rights era, opening onto another question I've been asking myself: how might works made in that era in Birmingham by both Black and white artists be infused with the city's industrial history? This influence carries across the work of other contemporary Alabama artists, including Thornton Dial, who was employed as a steelworker before he began creating. Dial, too, uses industrial materials as part of his practice and references his life as an industrial laborer to create paintings about class, race, current events, and African-American history. In the top of the line, steel, In the top of the line, steel, Dial paints mob theft during the Los Angeles riots in 1992, but he connects these race riots to his personal history as a steel worker through the elision of steel and steel in the title. Not knowing the work, I was also really struck last night by Last Americans, which is on view in the long hallway, because of sort of like a material complexity to it. I'm not sure what Dial's using. I think it's probably aged wood of some kind, but he's figured out a way to make it look almost petrified and there's a finish on it that makes it look a little bit like slag, which again is that byproduct of the iron and steel manufacturing. So I think there are a lot of ways in which you can see that in his work. These themes continue through the work of other major contemporary artists working in Birmingham today, but I'll conclude with just one more artist and one more work. Joe Minter, too, is connecting an African past to an African American present, both in his emissary sculptures that exist beyond his environmental installation, African Village in America, and in the African Village itself. In Earth Movers, which you see here, Minter has created an 8-foot-tall, welded metal sculpture containing, quote, all the tools people have used to plant or move the earth by hand or animal, end quote. Here, Minter says, quote, they are honored for what they gave. Minter's environment addresses burial traditions, the relationship between text and image, the legacy of interracial violence in Birmingham, religious practice and iconography, African American history, Black histories of art, and yes, the role of the iron and steel industry in the social history of Central Alabama. Like the works of Lonnie Holley and Thornton Dial, Minter's Earth Movers allows me to conclude by asking what can be expanded in this history of the art of industrial Alabama, and where the histories Minter is dedicated to telling and monumentalizing can be found throughout the earlier art of industrial Alabama. Thank you. One question? Okay.
Thank you. Does anybody have a question? Anybody? I have one. Come.
It's essentially, Graham, do you know exact numbers? I don't know exact numbers. It's significantly depreciated. It's not a major sector for Birmingham's economy anymore. What's that?
The pollution
Controls, yeah. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those came in. Yes. Yeah, UAB, and then also there was a wave of sort of banking as a major sector for Birmingham, and now medical technology is another thing. So,
do you know whether there are any paintings or other artworks other than photographs of the convict labor that was used in the mines and the industries there?
Not that I've found, but I'm also not confident that that doesn't exist. I think that's just a question of additional research, and it's something I'd like to pursue trying to find, particularly in photography. I mean, I think you might find more representations, but I haven't found anything that suggests specifically that it's a representation of that.
One more.
Okay.
When Cole started, did he want to be an environmentalist, or did what he see make his work progress more to the area that we saw, the fog, the dirt? Did it develop in him, or was it automatically there?
I don't think Coe's an environmentalist at all, really. I think you can read these through an environmental lens now. I think Coe is really glorifying industry in these. He's celebrating industry and industrial production. And in a way, I think in the 30s, all of these people are picturing that smog as a kind of celebration or even just an indicator of sort of the intensity of the industrial activity in Birmingham. Are we good?
All right. Thank you. We'll get the next speaker up there.